the most dangerous fault in North America spent the night of July 14th doing something that should unsettle you far more than an earthquake would. It stayed almost completely silent. While faults all around the Pacific Rim were shaking in 5s and 6s, the Cascadia Subduction Zone gave off only a whisper. A surge of deep tremor spread along its entire length, from British Columbia down to Northern California, and a single tiny earthquake stirring 16 miles down at its southern end. That silence is not safety. On a fault that has been locked and loading for 326 years, ever since the magnitude 9 that struck in the year 1700, silence is the sound of a spring being wound tighter, and that tremor was a rare look at the winding. So how exactly do you watch a fault that is built to give no warning at all, right up until the moment it releases 3 centuries of stored stress at once? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Count That Doesn't Belong. 307. That was the number on the screen on the night of July 14th, 2026, and it was not a number that belonged to any single earthquake. It was a tally of something quieter and stranger. Along the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the great fault that runs offshore from Northern California, up through Oregon and Washington to the coast of Vancouver Island, an automated tracker had counted 307 separate points of seismic tremor in a single monitoring window. And here is the part that made a routine night stop feeling routine. Those 307 points were not huddled together in one place. They were smeared along the entire length of the fault, from the extreme northern end near Vancouver Island, all the way down to the extreme southern end off the California coast, with the segments in between filling in as the hours passed. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what tremor even is, because it is not what most people picture when they hear the word earthquake. A normal earthquake is a violent, sudden thing. The ground lurches, the energy comes out in seconds, and it is over. Tremor is the opposite. It is a faint, drawn-out, low-frequency hum from deep inside the fault, so weak that no human being standing on the surface would ever feel it. You cannot sense it. Your windows do not rattle. The only way anyone knows it is happening is that sensitive instruments buried in the ground pick up the signal, and a computer maps where it is coming from. And on that night, the map lit up along the whole margin at once. Let me put a finer point on why the shape of that signal mattered more than the size of the number. On a typical night, when this deep tremor shows up at all, it tends to appear in one region, a patch of dots concentrated in a single stretch of the fault while the rest of the margin stays dark. That is the normal behavior. A segment breathes, then goes quiet, then another segment breathes weeks or months later. What happened on the night of the 14th was different in character. The dots were not in one patch. They ran the whole line, the extreme north near Vancouver Island, the extreme south off California, and the ground in between activating as the hours went on. Imagine a string of lights along a coastline flickering on, not in one cluster, but from one end to the other. That end-to-end quality is what makes an experienced watcher sit up, because it suggests the deep part of the fault is active along much more of its length than usual. And you have to hold in your mind just how much coastline that line represents, because the abstraction of a fault on a map hides the human reality. The Cascadia Subduction Zone runs offshore of a stretch of the continent that is home to millions of people. Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, Salem, Eugene, and the long chain of coastal towns from the Olympic Peninsula down through the Oregon coast and into Northern California all sit within reach of this fault. When the tremor lights up the entire margin, it is not lighting up an empty line in the ocean. It is tracing the deep boundary beneath one of the most beautiful and heavily populated coastlines in North America. That is the reason a number like 307, spread the way it was spread, is worth stopping the routine nightly scan to look at twice. Sitting inside that field of tremor was one small, ordinary earthquake, a magnitude 2.6 right down at the southern end of the zone, offshore of Northern California. On any other night that quake would be invisible, forgettable, the kind of tiny shudder that happens thousands of times a year around the planet and means nothing. But 2 details made this one worth a second look. The first is where it sat. It was not up in one of the shallow, familiar crustal faults near the surface. It was down at roughly 16 miles deep, in the deeper part of the Cascadia interface, the region where the 2 tectonic plates actually grind against each other. The second detail is the company it was keeping. A tiny deep quake alone is nothing. A tiny deep quake sitting inside a margin-wide surge of tremor is a data point in a much larger question. And that question is the reason we are here tonight. Because the Cascadia Subduction Zone is not just another fault. It is the fault that produced a magnitude 9.0 earthquake in the year 1700. It is a fault that, on average, unleashes one of these monsters every few centuries. And as of this year, it has been 326 years since the last one. So when the deep engine of that particular fault starts humming from one end to the other, and a small stress quake stirs at the southern tip, the natural human instinct is to ask a single blunt question. Is this it? Is this the beginning of the one they have been warning us about for decades? That instinct, that jump straight to the worst case, is completely understandable, and it is worth naming honestly rather than pretending we are all above it. When you know a catastrophe is coming, and you know it is genuinely capable of reshaping an entire region, every flicker of activity feels like it might be the flicker, the first tremor of the end. This is the psychology that makes a fault like Cascadia so hard to think about clearly. It sits in a strange category of threat, one that is absolutely certain to happen eventually and absolutely impossible to predict in the moment, and the human mind is not well built for that combination. We want a signal. We want the activity to mean something specific about the timing. And the hardest, most important discipline in this entire subject is learning to sit with a signal that is real, that is measured, that matters, and that still does not tell you what you most want to know. So that is the balance I want to strike tonight, and I will try to hold it the whole way through. I am not going to tell you the tremor means nothing, because it does not mean nothing. It is a direct, rare look at the most dangerous fault on the continent doing the very thing that will eventually break it. But I am also not going to tell you it means the earthquake is next week, because nobody can tell you that, and anyone who does is selling something. What I can do is show you exactly what the fault is, what that tremor actually represents, what scientists genuinely know and genuinely do not, and why the quiet you feel on that coastline is the most important and most misunderstood part of the entire story. I want to be careful and honest with you right from the start because this story does not reward panic and it does not reward dismissal either. The tremor is not the earthquake. The tremor cannot tell you when the earthquake will come. Scientists are extremely clear on that point, and we are going to spend real time on why. But the tremor is also not nothing. It is a genuine, measured signal that the most dangerous fault in North America is doing something, and that something is quietly connected to the very process that will, someday, make it break. The calm you feel standing on that coastline is real. It is also, in a way that most people never think about, the single most dangerous feature of the entire system. So let me show you exactly what lit up that night, what it means, and what the people whose job it is to watch this fault are actually watching for. Part 2. The fault that learned to stay quiet. Picture the coastline of the Pacific Northwest from above. Now picture a line drawn in the ocean, roughly 70 to 100 miles offshore, running for about 1,000 kilometers, a little over 600 miles parallel to the coast. That line is the surface trace of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and beneath it 2 enormous pieces of the Earth are locked in a slow-motion collision that has been going on for millions of years. On one side you have the North American plate, the continent you are standing on. On the other side, out in the Pacific, you have a much smaller oceanic plate called the Juan de Fuca plate, along with a couple of even smaller fragments. That oceanic plate is being shoved eastward, and where it meets the continent it does not stop. It dives. It bends downward and slides underneath North America, sinking into the hot interior of the planet at a rate of a few centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernails grow. That process, one plate diving beneath another, is called subduction, and it is the single most powerful earthquake-making machine on Earth. Every earthquake above magnitude 9 in recorded history has come from a subduction zone exactly like this one. It is worth sitting with that last fact for a second, because it puts Cascadia in company that should command respect. The largest earthquake ever recorded, the magnitude 9.5 that struck Chile in 1960, was a subduction earthquake. The magnitude 9 that devastated northern Japan in 2011 and triggered the Fukushima disaster was a subduction earthquake. The magnitude 9 that struck Alaska in 1964 and the one that generated the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, both subduction earthquakes. This narrow category of fault, where an ocean plate dives beneath a continent, is responsible for essentially every truly civilization-scale earthquake in the modern record. Cascadia is not a lesser cousin of those faults. It is the same kind of fault, the same geometry, the same potential, sitting off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. The Juan de Fuca plate itself is a remnant, and that detail is quietly important. It is the shrinking leftover of a once enormous oceanic plate called the Farallon Plate, most of which has already been swallowed beneath North America over tens of millions of years. What remains off the Pacific Northwest is a relatively small slab, but small does not mean weak. It is still being driven relentlessly under the continent, and because it is younger and warmer than some ocean plates, it resists diving smoothly, which contributes to the way the shallow part of the boundary locks up rather than sliding freely. The plate is small, the convergence is slow, and yet the combination has been sufficient to build, over the centuries since 1700, the potential for one of the largest earthquakes this continent can produce. Here is where it gets unsettling. When one plate slides under another, the boundary between them is not smooth. In the deeper, hotter part of that boundary, the rock is soft and gummy enough that the two plates can creep past each other more or less continuously. But up in the shallower part, closer to the surface, the rock is cold and brittle and rough, and the two plates snag on each other. They stick. Temperature is the hidden variable that organizes this whole picture, and it is worth making explicit. As the ocean plate dives deeper, it gets hotter, and hot rock behaves differently from cold rock. Down deep, past a certain temperature, the rock is warm enough to deform and creep steadily rather than snapping, which is why the deepest part of the interface slides more or less continuously and never builds up the kind of strain that produces a great earthquake. Nearer the surface, the rock is cold, and cold rock is brittle. It does not creep. It locks, holds, and accumulates strain until it fails suddenly. In between those two zones lies the transitional region where episodic tremor and slip happens, a place that is neither fully locked nor fully creeping, where the fault slips in those slow, silent pulses. So the fault is layered by depth and temperature, a locked brittle top, a slipping ductile bottom, and that strange transitional band in the middle where the tremor lives. That layered structure is the key to understanding why the tremor and the great earthquake come from different places. The tremor and slow slip originate in the transitional band deeper down. The great earthquake originates in the cold, brittle, locked zone above it. The two are connected because the slipping band loads the locked band, but they are not the same part of the fault, and they behave in completely different ways. Hold on to that distinction, because it is the single most important reason that watching the tremor cannot tell you when the locked zone will break. You're watching one layer of the fault to infer the state of another, and the layer that will actually produce the earthquake stays silent. Geologists call this the locked zone, and it is the core of the danger. Because while the deep part keeps creeping and the plates keep converging, the locked zone does not move at all. It just sits there, stuck, while the strain builds and builds behind it, like a spring being wound tighter every single year for centuries. And this is the crucial thing to understand about Cascadia specifically, the thing that sets it apart from a fault like the San Andreas. Cascadia is quiet, almost eerily quiet. The San Andreas is constantly producing small and moderate earthquakes as it grinds along, releasing its stress in frequent little installments. Cascadia does not do that. Its locked zone barely makes a sound. For decades, scientists actually debated whether Cascadia was dangerous at all, precisely because it was so seismically silent. Some argued the plates might just be sliding smoothly past each other, harmlessly, with no strain accumulating. If that were true, there would be no great earthquake to fear. That comforting idea turned out to be dead wrong, and the way we learned it was wrong is one of the great detective stories in the history of geology, which we will get to. But hold on to the central irony, because it is the spine of everything that follows. A noisy fault is a fault that is releasing its stress. A silent fault is a fault that is storing it. Cascadia's silence was never safety. It was the sound of a spring being wound. The quiet is the loading. Consider what that locked zone is actually doing beneath the surface, because the physics of it is what makes the quiet so treacherous. The two plates are converging by a few centimeters every year. That motion never stops. But at the locked zone, the plates are stuck fast, which means the surface of the continent cannot move forward the way the deep plate is dragging it. So instead of sliding, the crust deforms, it compresses, It bulges upward and gets pulled inland, storing the strain like a diving board, bent under a weight that never lifts. Precise measurements show the coast of Oregon and Washington doing exactly this right now, squeezing and rising by a few millimeters a year. Every one of those millimeters is elastic energy going into the ground, energy that has only one way out. When the locked zone finally gives, all of that stored deformation snaps back at once, and the snapping back is the earthquake. The coast that has been slowly bulging for centuries lurches seaward and drops in a matter of minutes. That is why a fault can be dead silent and mortally dangerous at the same time, and it is a genuinely counterintuitive idea, so it is worth stating plainly. Absence of earthquakes on a subduction fault is not the same as absence of danger. On a fault that is truly sliding freely, the silence would be reassuring. On a fault that is locked, the silence means the strain has nowhere to go but into the rock, accumulating year after year, decade after decade, with no small releases to bleed it off. The longer the quiet, the larger the eventual snap. Cascadia has been quiet for 326 years. That is not 326 years of safety. It is 326 years of loading. And that is why a night when the fault suddenly gets a little less quiet, when 307 points of deep tremor light up along its entire length, is a night worth paying attention to. Not because the tremor is the release, but because the tremor is a rare direct look at the machine that does the winding. So what is that tremor actually? What is the deep part of the fault doing when it hums like that? Because it turns out the answer connects the silence and the danger in a way that scientists only discovered in the last couple of decades, and it changes how you should think about every one of those 307 dots on the map. Part 3. The Chatter of Silent Slip. For most of the history of earthquake science, the picture of a fault was simple. Either it was stuck, quietly accumulating strain, or it broke, releasing that strain in an earthquake, stuck or broken, loading or failing. There was nothing in between. Then, around the turn of the millennium, scientists watching the Cascadia margin with new and more sensitive instruments found something that did not fit either category, and it quietly rewrote the textbook. What they found was this. Every so often, on a remarkably regular schedule, the deep part of the Cascadia fault would come unstuck and slip. Not in a violent earthquake, but slowly, silently, over days and even weeks. Global positioning stations planted along the coast, precise enough to measure the ground moving by a few millimeters, would suddenly show the land reversing direction, creeping backward as the deep plate boundary released a burst of pent-up motion. To appreciate how surprising this was, you have to remember that it violated the basic categories scientists had used for a century. An earthquake was, by definition, a rapid event. The whole point of a fault sticking and then slipping was that the slip happened fast, releasing energy as seismic waves you could feel. The idea that a fault could slip meaningfully, moving as much as it might in a moderate earthquake, but do it so slowly that it produced no felt shaking at all, was genuinely new. Researchers started calling these slow earthquakes, and they turned out not to be a Cascadia oddity, but a phenomenon found on subduction zones around the world, in Japan, in Mexico, in New Zealand. Cascadia just happened to be one of the places where it was first clearly recognized, and where its clockwork regularity stood out most. The name they settled on captures the two halves of the phenomenon perfectly. Episodic, because it comes in discrete episodes on a recurring schedule. Tremor and slip, because it pairs that faint seismic hum with measurable movement of the ground. Neither half was obvious before the instruments got good enough to catch them together. The tremor is so weak it was long dismissed as noise, and the slip is so slow it is invisible without precise satellite positioning. It took both technologies, maturing at the same time, to reveal that the deep fault has this secret second life, moving in slow motion between its rare violent ruptures, and at the exact same time seismometers would pick up that faint low hum, the tremor, coming from the same deep region. The slow slip and the tremor arrived together, hand in hand every time. Scientists gave the combined phenomenon a name, episodic tremor and slip, the chatter of silent slip. Now here is what makes it remarkable, and why those instruments in the Pacific Northwest were watching so closely on the night of July 14th. This is not random. In northern Washington and under southern Vancouver Island, these episodes recur roughly every 14 months, so reliably that scientists can nearly circle the next one on a calendar. Further south, in central Oregon, the rhythm stretches to something more like 22 months, and down at the southern end of the zone, off northern California, the episodes come even more frequently, for reasons that genuinely remain unexplained. Think about what that means. The most dangerous fault on the continent has a deep heartbeat, a slow, silent pulse that ticks along on a schedule measured in months. And each pulse is a burst of movement on the fault that you would never feel. The regularity is almost eerie when you dwell on it. There are few things in earthquake science that behave on a schedule you can predict, because earthquakes themselves are famously unpredictable. But these slow slip events, at least in the northern part of Cascadia, arrive with a rhythm so consistent that researchers have been able to forecast them within a window of a month or so, watch the calendar, and then see the tremor show up more or less on cue. It is one of the only genuinely clock-like behaviours anyone has found on a major fault, and it has turned Cascadia into a kind of natural laboratory, a place where scientists can actually study a fault in the act of slipping rather than waiting decades for a single catastrophic event. Every 14 months in the north, roughly, the deep boundary comes unstuck, glides forward a few centimetres over a couple of weeks, hums with tremor while it does, and then locks back up. Why the southern end runs faster is one of the open puzzles, and it is not a trivial one given where the fresh activity concentrated on the night of the 14th. Something about the temperature, the fluids, the geometry, or the composition of the fault in the southern segment makes it slip more often than the rest of the margin. Scientists can describe the pattern precisely, but cannot yet fully explain it, and that uncertainty is a reminder that even the best-studied fault on Earth still holds secrets in its deep structure. What is clear is that the southern portion is the most restless part of the deep fault, and it is also, as we will see, the part with the shorter interval between its great earthquakes. Restless deep, shorter fuse shallow. Those two facts sitting on the same stretch of coast are why a trained eye lingered on the southern end that night. But a pulse of movement is not harmless, and this is the part that connects directly back to that field of tremor lighting up the map. When the deep zone slips, it relieves stress down there, in the deep gummy region. But it does not make that stress disappear, it transfers it. Every time the deep part lunges forward, it gives a small tug on the locked zone up above it, the cold, brittle patch that is stuck and storing centuries of strain. Each slow slip event nudges that locked zone a tiny increment closer to the day it finally lets go. The deep fault breathing out is the shallow fault being loaded in. Scientists describe episodic tremor and slip as an integral part of the earthquake cycle for exactly this reason. It is not a sideshow. It is one of the mechanisms quietly winding the spring, and the amount of stress each episode transfers is small on its own, a nudge rather than a shove, but the episodes are relentless, arriving over and over across the decades and centuries, each one adding its increment to the load already stored in the cold rock above. Multiply a small nudge by the hundreds of episodes that occur over a full seismic cycle, and you begin to see how the deep fault, in its quiet, patient way, participates in building the very catastrophe it never directly produces. So when you look back at that map from the night of the 14th, at 307 tremor epicenters strung along the whole margin, you're not looking at 307 tiny earthquakes. You're looking at the visible fingerprint of the deep fault slipping, of stress being handed upward toward the locked zone along the entire length of Cascadia at once. That is why the full-length distribution was the telling part, more than the raw count. Tremor concentrated in one segment is the fault breathing in one spot. Tremor lit up from Vancouver Island to California is the machine running end to end. Let me draw out the significance of that discovery a little more, because when scientists first realized that slow slip loads the locked zone, it genuinely reframed how they thought about the danger. Before, the picture was static, a locked fault quietly accumulating strain at a steady rate until it snapped. After, the picture became dynamic, a locked zone being fed stress not just continuously, but in these discrete pulses, each slow slip episode delivering a small measurable increment of load. It meant the fault was not just passively winding, it was being actively nudged toward failure on a recurring schedule, over and over, every 14 or 22 months depending on where you looked. The deep fault is, in effect, tapping on the door of the locked zone at regular intervals, and one of those taps someday will coincide with the locked zone finally being ready to give. That reframing is also what makes the honest limit so frustrating and so important at the same time, because if every slow slip event nudges the locked zone closer to failure, you might think that watching the slow slip events would eventually let you count down to the break. But the increments are tiny compared to the total strain stored over centuries, and the locked zone gives no indication of how close to its threshold it actually is. So you can watch the taps on the door all you like, and you still cannot know whether the door will open on the next tap or the 1000th. The mechanism is real, the loading is real, and the ceiling on prediction is real, all at the same time. And yet, I have to keep pulling us back to the hard, honest limit, because it would be so easy to run past it. All of this deep activity, all of this loading, tells you the fault is behaving the way a loaded fault behaves. It does not tell you the day. It does not tell you the year. A slow slip event slightly raises the odds that a great earthquake could be triggered while it is happening, and Cascadia scientists have at times issued quiet, low-key advisories during especially large episodes for exactly that reason. But the operative word is slightly. The great majority of these episodes come, transfer their stress, and end with absolutely nothing dramatic. The deep pulse is real. The loading is real. The countdown does not exist. Which raises the obvious next question. If this fault has a heartbeat we can see, and a spring we know is winding, then how tightly is it wound right now? How long has it actually been since Cascadia last let go, and how do we even know? For that answer, we have to go back 326 years, to a winter night in the year 1700, and a wave that arrived in Japan with no earthquake attached to it. Part 4. The Orphan Wave. On the evening of January 26th in the year 1700, something happened along the Pacific Northwest coast that no one wrote down, because the people who felt it had no written language, and the people who kept written records were thousands of miles away and had never heard of the place. Around 9 o'clock at night, roughly 1,000 kilometers of the Cascadia megathrust, essentially the entire fault from end to end, tore loose all at once. The most careful reconstructions put it at a moment magnitude of about 9.0, with the fault slipping something on the order of 19 meters, more than 60 feet in a matter of minutes. The coastline dropped. Forests along the shore sank below the reach of the tides in an instant, and a wall of water rose off the coast and began racing outward across the Pacific in every direction. Now, for a long time, the story of that night was completely invisible to history. There were no seismographs in 1700. There were no tide gauges. The oral histories of the First Nations and tribes who lived along that coast, from Vancouver Island to Northern California, carried memories of a terrible night of shaking and a great flood, but Western science had no way to date them precisely. The earthquake had happened, and then it had vanished into the past without a timestamp. That is what makes what came next one of the most extraordinary pieces of detective work in all of Earth science. Because across the ocean, in Japan, people did keep meticulous written records, and in the archives of several coastal villages on the island of Honshu, historians found accounts of something baffling. On a night in late January of that year, the sea had risen without warning and flooded homes and fields, damaging villages up and down the coast. A destructive tsunami had come ashore, but there had been no earthquake, no shaking preceded it. The Japanese chroniclers were describing a wave with no parent, a tsunami with no local cause. Scientists later gave it a hauntingly appropriate name. They called it the Orphan Tsunami. Think about how strange that record must have seemed to the people who lived it. A tsunami, in a country that knows tsunamis intimately, almost always comes with a warning that everyone there understood instinctively. The ground shakes, hard, and then you run for high ground because the sea is coming. That is the pattern, drilled into coastal Japanese communities over centuries of hard experience. But in late January of 1700 the sequence broke. The ground did not shake. There was no felt earthquake anywhere in Japan that could account for it. And yet the sea rose, flooded fields, damaged buildings, and receded, leaving behind a mystery that the local officials dutifully wrote down without any way to explain it. Those written records, preserved in temple and village archives, would sit for nearly 300 years before anyone connected them to a coastline on the other side of the world. The precision of the reconstruction is what makes it so powerful. Because tsunamis travel at a known speed across the open ocean, scientists could take the recorded arrival times in Japan and run the clock backward. A wave crossing the Pacific from the Cascadia coast to Honshu takes roughly 9 to 10 hours. The Japanese records place the wave's arrival on the night of what corresponds to January 27th and into the 28th on their calendar. Subtract the travel time, account for the date line, and you arrive at an earthquake on the American coast on the evening of January 26th, 1700, at approximately 9 o'clock at night. A 300-year-old flood in Japan, timed to the hour, became the clock that dated an earthquake nobody on the American side had ever recorded. There are few pieces of scientific detective work as elegant or as unsettling as reading the exact night a magnitude 9 struck by studying the water damage it caused 5,000 miles away. For centuries the orphans sat in those archives, an unexplained curiosity. Then, in the 1990s, researchers connected the pieces. A tsunami takes about 9 to 10 hours to cross the Pacific from the Cascadia coast to Japan. Work backward from the time the wave struck Honshu, and you arrive at roughly 9 o'clock in the evening Pacific time on January 26, 1700. The orphan's parent was Cascadia. A magnitude 9 earthquake on the far side of the ocean had sent a wave that announced itself in Japan while the coast that birthed it lay in the dark, its own devastation unrecorded by any pen. And here is where the detective story becomes almost unbelievable. Scientists went looking for physical proof on the American coast, and they found it in the trees. Along the tidal marshes of Washington and Oregon, there are stands of dead cedar and spruce, grey skeletons rooted in the mud, killed when the land suddenly dropped and salt water drowned their roots. These are the ghost forests. By counting and matching the growth rings of those drowned trees, dendrochronologists could pin down the exact year the trees died. The outermost ring, the last full year of growth, was 1699. The trees died in the dormant season that followed, the winter of 1700. Sit with the elegance of that for a moment. A tree records its life in rings, one per year, and when a tree dies, its outermost ring marks its final growing season. These drowned coastal trees, preserved in the anoxic mud that kept them from fully rotting, still held their rings 3 centuries later. By matching the ring patterns against long master chronologies built from living and dead trees across the region, researchers could assign calendar years to those rings with confidence. And the answer that came back, that the trees stopped growing after 1699 and were dead by the following winter, matched the Japanese flood records to the season. 2 completely independent clocks, tree biology on one continent and human record keeping on another, agreeing on the same winter. And there was a third clock that had been keeping time all along, in the memories of the people who lived on that coast. The First Nations and tribes of the Pacific Northwest carried oral histories of a catastrophic night, stories of the ground shaking, of villages swept away by a great wave, of whole communities lost, passed down through generations long before any scientist arrived to measure a tree ring. For a long time, Western science treated those accounts as folklore rather than data. The 1700 reconstruction forced a reckoning with that dismissal, because the oral histories had preserved accurately the memory of a real magnitude 9 earthquake across 300 years of retelling. The trees, the marshes, the Japanese archives, and the oral traditions all pointed at the same night. 4 independent witnesses to an event no instrument ever recorded. The trees, the buried marshes, the Japanese temple records, and the oral histories of the coastal peoples all pointed at the same night. 4 independent lines of evidence separated by an ocean and 3 centuries agreeing to the season. That is how we know Cascadia is a magnitude 9 machine. It signed its work, and we finally learned to read the signature. The question that leaves hanging is the one that should make the hair on your neck stand up. If that was the last time, and it was 326 years ago, then where exactly are we in the cycle right now? Part 5. 326 years. The number by itself does not mean much until you put it next to the rhythm of the fault. 326 years since the last great Cascadia earthquake. Is that a long time? A short time? Is the fault overdue, or is it barely getting started? To answer that, scientists had to do something that sounds impossible. They had to reconstruct the earthquake history of a fault stretching back not centuries but thousands of years, long before anyone was writing anything down anywhere near it. They did it by reading the ground itself. When a great subduction earthquake strikes Cascadia, it leaves signatures that get buried and preserved. Coastal marshes suddenly drop and get capped by a layer of sand carried in by the tsunami, then slowly build back up, only to drop again in the next earthquake, creating a stacked record of buried soils. Offshore, the violent shaking triggers underwater landslides, that send distinctive layers of sediment cascading down the continental slope, and those layers, called turbidites, pile up on the seafloor in sequence, each one a fingerprint of a past quake. By drilling into those marshes and coring the deep sea floor, geologists assembled a calendar of Cascadia's great earthquakes going back roughly 6,500 years. The turbidite record deserves a moment of appreciation because it is one of the cleverest ideas in the field. When the ground shakes violently enough during a great earthquake, sediment that has been sitting loosely on the steep underwater slopes off the coast breaks loose and flows downhill in an underwater avalanche, settling in the deep sea as a distinct layer with coarse material at the bottom and fine material at the top. Between earthquakes, ordinary slow sedimentation lays down a completely different kind of layer. So a core of the seafloor becomes a stack of alternating bands, ordinary mud, then a jolt layer, then ordinary mud, then another jolt layer, like tree rings or the pages of a book. And remarkably, cores taken from widely separated points along the margin show these jolt layers matching up, the same events recorded in multiple places, which is exactly what you would expect if a single enormous earthquake shook the entire coast at once, rather than a series of smaller local ones. When researchers count those layers and date them, the picture that emerges is a fault with a long and irregular history of great earthquakes. The marsh record and the turbidite record together suggest something on the order of 19 or more major events over roughly the last 6,500 years, some of them full margin ruptures that shook the entire coast, others partial ruptures confined mostly to the southern portion. It is worth pausing on the fact that we can say this at all. 300 years ago, no one knew Cascadia could produce a great earthquake. Today we have a rough calendar of its behaviour stretching back to before the pyramids were finished, assembled from drowned forests, buried marshes, deep-sea mud, foreign flood records, and the preserved memories of the people who lived through the last one. That is the foundation on which every probability estimate rests, and it is why scientists take the fault so seriously even in the absence of any felt activity. What that calendar shows is sobering. Over that span, the fault has produced something like 19 great earthquakes. The average time between full margin ruptures, the big end-to-end events like 1700, comes out to roughly 500 years, with some estimates stretching the average toward 500 or 600. So at 326 years, are we overdue for a full margin rupture? Not by that average alone. We are well into the cycle, past the halfway mark, but not past the typical interval for the entire fault going at once. But averages, as we touched on, hide the drama that lives in the spread. Some of the intervals in Cascadia's record are short, only a couple of centuries between great earthquakes. Others are enormous, stretching toward 1,000 years of quiet before the fault finally let go. This irregularity is itself important, because it tells you the fault does not operate like a metronome. It operates more like a system that crosses a threshold when enough strain has built up, and the amount of strain it takes and the rate at which it accumulates can vary. That is part of why prediction is so hard even with a long record in hand. Knowing the average tells you roughly where you are in the range of possibilities. It does not tell you which of those possibilities this particular cycle will follow. What the record does establish beyond any doubt is that this is not a hypothetical threat or a matter of scientific speculation. The fault has done this again and again and again, 19 or more times that we can read in the mud and the marshes, and there is no reason whatsoever to think it has stopped. The plates are still converging, the locked zone is still locked, the strain is still accumulating. Every mechanism that produced those 19 past earthquakes is fully operational today. The only open question is timing, and timing is precisely the question the record cannot answer. It can tell you the fault will break. It cannot tell you when, but that average hides the most important detail, and it is the detail that connects straight back to what lit up on the map that July night. The intervals are not regular. They range from as little as a couple of centuries to as long as 1,000 years, and crucially, the fault does not always break along its whole length. The southern portion of Cascadia, the stretch offshore southern Oregon, and northern California ruptures more often than the fault as a whole. On its own, that southern segment appears to let go every 200 to 300 years. Read that number again, and then remember where that small magnitude 2.6 struck, and where the fresh tremor was concentrating that night. The southern end, the end with the shorter fuse. The word overdue deserves a careful unpacking here, because it gets thrown around loosely and it can mislead in both directions. In everyday language, Overdue implies something that should have happened already, like a library book past its return date, and that framing can make people think a great earthquake is somehow late and therefore imminent. But faults do not run on schedules the way library books do. A recurrence interval is an average drawn from a set of intervals that vary widely, and being past the average simply means you're in the range where the event becomes increasingly likely, not that it is due on a particular timetable. For the full margin, at 326 years against an average near 500, Cascadia is well into its cycle, but not past its typical interval. For the southern segment at a recurrence of 200 to 300 years, 326 years means that stretch of fault is at or beyond its average interval. That is a meaningful distinction, and it is the technical reason the southern end draws the extra attention. But even there, honesty requires holding the uncertainty. Faults routinely blow past their average intervals and stay quiet for far longer before finally rupturing. The southern segment being at or beyond its mean does not mean it will go this decade or even this century. It means the probability is elevated relative to a segment fresh off a rupture, nothing more precise than that. The geology gives us a loaded set of odds, not a due date, and anyone who tells you Cascadia is overdue in the sense of about to happen is claiming a certainty the science does not contain. This is why the person watching the map that night leaned toward a specific reading, and it is a reading the science supports. The southern segment is the part of Cascadia that is closest to, or arguably already within, its own typical recurrence window. It carries the higher near-term odds, and it is exactly the part that was showing the day's fresh activation, exactly where the deep stress quake appeared. None of that is a prediction. The fault has no obligation to follow its average, and a long quiet stretch can persist far past the mean. But the clock, the geography, and the night's activity all point at the same corner of the map. The next obvious question is how scientists turn that into actual numbers, actual odds, and what the difference really is between the southern end letting go alone and the entire fault going at once. Because those two scenarios are not the same disaster at all. Part 6. Partial or whole. There is a temptation, when people talk about the Cascadia earthquake, to picture a single event, one apocalyptic rupture, the big one, capital B, capital O. But the fault does not see it that way, and neither do the scientists who study it. Cascadia has at least two very different faces, and understanding the difference is the key to reading a night like July 14th correctly. The first face is the full margin rupture. This is the 1700 scenario, and it is the one that defines the region's worst case. The entire fault, all 1,000 kilometers of it, breaks in a single event, producing a magnitude of roughly 9, shaking that lasts not seconds but minutes, and a tsunami that strikes the coast within a matter of tens of minutes while also crossing the ocean to threaten the far side of the Pacific. When people talk about Cascadia being able to level the Pacific Northwest, this is the version they mean. The second face is the partial rupture. Here, only a portion of the fault lets go, most commonly that southern segment we just talked about. A partial rupture is still a monster. It can still be a magnitude 8 or higher, still catastrophic for the region it hits. But it is a smaller, more localized catastrophe than the full margin event, and, importantly, it appears to happen more often. So what are the actual odds? Scientists express Cascadia's hazard in terms of the probability of a great earthquake in the next 50 years, roughly a human lifetime, or the span of a mortgage, a way of making a geologic threat feel like a human one. For the full margin, magnitude 9 event, the estimates generally land somewhere around 10 to 15% over the next 50 years. Let that settle for a moment. Something like a 1 in 7 to 1 in 10 chance, in the next 50 years, of the entire Pacific Northwest coast being struck by one of the largest earthquakes this planet can produce. That is not a fringe scenario. That is a mainstream hazard estimate from the people whose job is to be careful. To make that number feel real, compare it to risks people take seriously all the time. A 1 in 10 chance over 50 years is not a remote once-in-a-civilization possibility. It is roughly the kind of odds that make a careful person buy insurance, retrofit a house, or keep supplies on hand. People fasten seatbelts and install smoke detectors against events far less likely than that. And unlike most risks, this one is not a matter of if but of when on a long enough horizon, because the fault will certainly rupture again eventually. The 50-year window is simply the slice of that certainty that overlaps with the lives and plans of the people living there now. Framed that way, 10 to 15% stop sounding abstract and start sounding like something a reasonable person prepares for. There is one more subtlety in these numbers that is easy to miss, and it matters for how you read a night of elevated tremor. These probabilities are what scientists call time-dependent. They are not a flat, unchanging background rate. They are informed by how long it has been since the last earthquake, and by how much strain has likely accumulated. As the decades since 1700 pile up, and as the fault sits deeper into its cycle, those odds do not stay frozen. They creep. Every year of quiet is, in a sense, a year that nudges the probability upward, because the fault is 1 year closer to the strain threshold it will eventually cross. The tremor on the night of the 14th did not move those odds, but the 326 years of silence behind it absolutely have, and the partial rupture of the southern segment carries higher odds still. Because that southern stretch breaks more frequently on its own, the probability of a magnitude 8 or larger event there climbs to something in the neighbourhood of 30% over the same 50 years, with some framings pushing that figure toward roughly 1 in 3. 1 in 3. That is the number sitting underneath the instinct that a southern partial rupture is the more likely near-term event. It is worth painting what that southern partial rupture would actually look like, because a magnitude 8 is often waved away as somehow the lesser scenario, and it is not. A magnitude 8 partial rupture of southern Cascadia would still be one of the largest earthquakes to strike the United States in living memory, dwarfing anything California has experienced in the modern era. It would deliver severe, prolonged shaking across northern California and southern Oregon, generate a dangerous local tsunami along that coast, and devastate communities from the Eureka and Crescent City area up through the southern Oregon shore. The reason it is called the lesser scenario is only relative to the full margin magnitude 9, which would hit that entire coastline plus everything from central Oregon through Washington and into British Columbia all at once. Both are catastrophes. The partial rupture is simply the more geographically contained one, and by the odds, the more likely one to come first. There is a further wrinkle that scientists genuinely worry about, and it connects the two scenarios in an uncomfortable way. A partial rupture of the southern segment would abruptly transfer stress onto the neighbouring still-locked sections of the fault to the north, potentially loading them closer to their own failure. In other words, a southern rupture does not necessarily relieve the broader threat. It could, in some scenarios, nudge the rest of the fault along. That does not mean one automatically triggers the other in short order, but it is one more reason the whole margin is watched as an interconnected system rather than a set of independent pieces, and one more reason that fresh activity at the southern end draws careful eyes. It is not pessimism, it is arithmetic drawn from the fault's own history. And it is why, when the tremor concentrated at the southern end and a deep stress quake stirred there on the night of the 14th, the honest read was not that a full magnitude 9 was suddenly imminent, but that the corner of the fault with the highest standing odds was the corner showing activity. Now I have to close the loop between those probabilities and that deep 2.6, because it would be easy to overstate the connection, and I do not want to do that. A single magnitude 2.6 earthquake is not a foreshock of a magnitude 8. It is not a countdown timer. Most small deep quakes in a subduction zone are just that, small deep quakes, part of the ordinary background of a fault that is constantly adjusting under load. What made this one worth mentioning at all is its context. It happened at the depth where the plates actually meet, not in a shallow crustal fault. It happened at the southern end, the segment with the shortest fuse, and it happened inside a margin-wide surge of the very tremor that signals the deep fault is transferring stress upward. On its own, it means little. Woven into everything else, it is a thread in the pattern. And the people who watch this fault for a living have to sit with exactly that ambiguity every single day, holding the difference between a thread and a warning, because their instruments can show them the fault loading but cannot show them the fault about to fail. So how do they actually do it? What are they watching? With what tools? And how do they keep from crying wolf when the deep fault hums? That is where the honest core of this whole story lives. Part 7. What they are actually watching. Let me take you inside the monitoring, because this is where a lot of the fear and a lot of the misunderstanding come from, and the truth is more interesting than either. When people imagine scientists watching Cascadia, they tend to picture something like a countdown, a gauge creeping toward red, an alarm that will sound when the fault reaches some critical threshold. That is not what exists. What exists is a set of instruments that let researchers see, in near real time, how the fault is behaving, without letting them see when it will break. Holding those two facts together is the whole discipline. The first tool is the seismic network. Across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, a dense web of seismometers listens to the ground constantly. Most of the time they are cataloguing ordinary small earthquakes, but a subset of them is tuned to detect that faint, low-frequency tremor, the chatter of slow slip. Those detections get processed and plotted on a public tremor map, updated continuously, and that map is very likely the origin of the 307 number from the night of July 14th. Anyone can look at it. There is no secret version. The dots you would see are the same dots the scientists see, which is worth remembering the next time someone tells you the authorities are hiding a Cascadia countdown. There is nothing to hide because the data is already public and it does not contain a date. It is genuinely worth understanding how much effort goes into detecting that tremor in the first place, because it explains why the signal is so faint and so easy to misread. Ordinary earthquakes announce themselves with sharp, distinct pulses of energy that are easy for a seismometer to catch and locate. Tremor is nothing like that. It is a low, sustained, formless rumble, more like a long murmur than a bang, and it is often buried in the ordinary background noise of the earth, the ocean waves pounding the coast, the wind, the rumble of human activity. Detecting it and pinpointing where it comes from requires comparing the signals across many stations and looking for the faint, coherent hum that shows up in all of them at once. It is painstaking work, and the fact that scientists can produce a clean map of hundreds of tremor epicenters at all is a real technical achievement. That difficulty is also part of why the raw count on any given night should be read with care. The number of tremor epicenters detected depends partly on how active the fault is, and partly on the sensitivity of the detection, the noise conditions, and how the automated system is tuned. A count like 307 is a meaningful indicator of an active episode, but it is not a precise dial reading of danger, and it certainly is not a countdown value. What matters more than the exact number is the pattern, the way the tremor was distributed along the whole margin, and what that pattern says about the deep fault slipping across a broad stretch of its length. The map is the message, far more than the tally. The second tool is geodesy, the precise measurement of the ground's position. Global positioning stations bolted to bedrock along the coast can detect the land shifting by mere millimeters. Between earthquakes, they show the coastline being slowly dragged eastward and squeezed, bulging upward and inland as the locked zone drags North America along with the sinking plate. That measured deformation is the direct evidence that the fault is locked and loading, and when a slow slip event begins, those same stations catch the reversal, the ground briefly springing back the other way as the deep fault slips. Marry the seismometers and the positioning stations together, and you get the full picture of episodic tremor and slip. The tremor tells you where, the geodesy tells you how much the fault moved. The reversal is a genuinely strange thing to contemplate. For most of the time between slow slip events, a positioning station on the coast is creeping steadily in one direction, dragged along as the locked plate pulls the continent with it. Then, during an episode, that same station stops, hesitates, and briefly travels backward in the opposite direction over the course of a couple of weeks, before resuming its normal creep once the episode ends. The land is quite literally recoiling a little as the deep fault lets go of some of its grip. It is far too slow and too small for anyone to feel, a few millimeters spread across days, but the instruments catch it cleanly, and it is one of the clearest confirmations that the deep boundary really is slipping during these tremor episodes rather than just vibrating in place. The ground moving the wrong way is the signature of the fault exhaling. Together, these tools have turned Cascadia from a black box into something closer to a monitored patient. Scientists can watch the deep slip migrate along the fault in near real time, tracking which segment is active on a given day and how the tremor front advances. They can measure the accumulated strain and estimate how much of the fault is fully locked versus partially creeping. They can compare each new episode to the decades of episodes that came before. All of that has enormously deepened our understanding of how this fault works, and yet, for all of it, the one thing that matters most to a person living above the fault, the date of the next great earthquake, remains stubbornly beyond reach. We have built an extraordinary window into the fault's behaviour, and the window shows us everything except the future. So with all of that, all of these instruments, all of this coverage, why can scientists not simply predict the earthquake? Here is the deepest, most honest answer in this entire story, and it is the second big revelation I promised you. It is not that we lack enough sensors, it is that the shallow locked zone, the part that will actually produce the great earthquake, does not announce itself. It sits there silent, storing strain, giving off almost no signal, right up until the moment it fails. The tremor we can see is happening deeper, below the locked zone, in a different part of the fault. It loads the locked zone, but it is not the locked zone talking. We're watching the deep engine turn and inferring that the shallow spring is winding, but the spring itself makes no sound we can read. That is why researchers are so careful to say that tremor and slow slip are not reliable predictors. During a slow slip event, the odds of triggering the big one tick up modestly, and honest scientists acknowledge that. Some small earthquakes near a locked fault turn out in hindsight to have been foreshocks, but most do not, and there is no way to tell the difference in advance. You cannot look at a foreshock and know it is a foreshock. You only earn that label after the main event proves it. The history of earthquake prediction is, frankly, a history of disappointment, and it is worth being honest about that because it explains why scientists are so guarded. For decades, researchers around the world chased the dream of a reliable precursor, some measurable signal, changes in groundwater, radon gas, animal behavior, patterns of small quakes, electrical signals in the crust that would consistently precede a large earthquake and allow a genuine warning. Some of these ideas showed tantalizing hints in individual cases. None of them has ever held up as a reliable, repeatable predictor that works before the fact rather than being spotted only in hindsight. Every so often a small quake really was a foreshock, and every so often the same kind of small quake was just a small quake, and no one has found a way to tell which is which in the moment. The field has largely and wisely shifted its energy away from short-term prediction and toward long-term forecasting and preparation, because the forecasting can be done honestly, and the prediction so far cannot. That shift is exactly why the language around Cascadia is so carefully chosen. Scientists talk about probabilities over decades, about hazard, about preparedness. They do not talk about when, because when is the one thing they have learned, through a century of hard experience, that they cannot deliver. So when the tremor lit up the whole margin on the night of the 14th, the most rigorous minds studying this fault did not reach for predictions. They noted an interesting episode, filed it into the long record of the fault's behavior, and kept watching, holding the same discipline that separates real science from the false comfort of a countdown that does not exist. So the watching is not a countdown, it is a window. It lets us understand how Cascadia behaves, refine the hazard estimates, and know in a general way that the fault is well into its cycle, and that the southern end carries the higher near-term odds. What it cannot do, what nothing can currently do, is tell a family in Seattle or Portland or Eureka that the earthquake will come next week or next decade or in 100 years. The fault is watched more closely than almost any on Earth, and it remains, by its very nature, silent about its own schedule. And just as scientists were sharpening that picture of a single locked fault loading toward failure, the fault threw them a genuine curveball, a discovery from earlier this year that revealed Cascadia is not even one clean slab of rock the way everyone had assumed. Part 8. The plate that is coming apart. Earlier this year, in the spring of 2026, a team using advanced seismic imaging to peer into the plate beneath the Pacific Northwest published something that genuinely surprised the field. For decades, the mental model of Cascadia had been reasonably simple. One oceanic plate, the Juan de Fuca and its neighbours, diving as a coherent slab beneath the continent. Clean, intact, a single sheet of rock bending into the earth. The new imaging showed that this picture is wrong. The subducting plate is not a single clean sheet at all. It is tearing itself apart as it goes down. The researchers described the plate fragmenting piece by piece, like a train slowly derailing, the cars breaking away one after another rather than the whole thing leaving the tracks at once. At the northern end of the system, off Vancouver Island, they mapped a crack in a fragment called the Explorer Plate that is roughly 35 kilometres long and drops about 5 kilometres straight down through solid rock. A section of ocean floor has effectively dropped by that 5 kilometres along a fault that is close to breaking clean through. And this crack is not a fossil, it is alive. Earthquakes of magnitude 6 and larger have ruptured along it multiple times in just the last 2 decades, which tells you the tearing is happening now, in geologic real time. The imaging that revealed this is worth understanding, because it shows how much of modern earthquake science happens out of sight. You cannot dig down and look at a plate 5 kilometers below the seafloor. Instead, scientists use the seismic waves from earthquakes, both natural and controlled, as a kind of medical scan of the deep earth. As those waves pass through rock of different densities and temperatures, they speed up, slow down, and bend, and by recording how they arrive at a dense network of instruments, researchers can reconstruct a three-dimensional image of the structure below, the way a CT scan builds a picture of the inside of a body from many angles. It was that kind of deep imaging, applied to the plate beneath the Pacific Northwest, that revealed the slab is not the clean, continuous sheet the older models assumed, but a fracturing, fragmenting thing with tears running through it. That changes the mental picture in an important way. For a long time, the working assumption was that a Cascadia rupture would behave like a rip through a single sheet of fabric, propagating cleanly from one end toward the other. But if the descending plate is broken into pieces in places, with tiers and boundaries between fragments, then the question of how far a rupture travels, whether it stops at a fragment boundary or jumps across it, becomes more complicated and more interesting. Some scientists think structural boundaries like these could act as barriers that halt a rupture, which is part of why the southern segment sometimes breaks on its own. Others caution that a large enough rupture might leap right past such boundaries. The tearing at the northern end is a vivid reminder that this fault is not a tidy diagram, but a living, complicated system we are still learning to read. If you were listening to that on the night of July 14th, with tremor lit up along the whole margin, one detail from the observations suddenly clicks into place. There was activity noted at the far northern end of the zone, out on the Explorer plate, that seemed to behave a little differently from the rest, and there had been talk that this region might be doing something unusual, even fracturing apart. That is not paranoia. That is the same phenomenon the imaging study revealed. The northern end of Cascadia really is a place where the descending plate is coming to pieces, and the small quakes out there are the sound of that slow disintegration. Now, here is where I have to be very careful, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets twisted in two opposite and equally wrong directions. On one side, people hear plate tearing apart and assume it must mean the big one is more imminent, that the fault is destabilizing, that this is the crack that will trigger everything. On the other side, people hear the plate is falling apart and conclude the opposite, that Cascadia must be shutting down, breaking up, losing its ability to produce a great earthquake so we can all relax. Both readings are wrong, and the researchers themselves said so plainly. The fragmentation of the plate does not necessarily increase the near-term danger. It changes our understanding of the structure at one end of the zone. It does not discharge the stored strain along the main locked length of the fault, and the timescale is the thing that keeps it honest. The Explorer plate is expected to fully detach from the rest of the descending slab, but not tomorrow, and not in your lifetime. That process is projected to take something like 1 million years, and when it finishes it will have shortened the active Cascadia Subduction Zone by about 75 kilometers, roughly 1/12 of its current length. 1 million years is one of those numbers that is almost impossible for the human mind to hold in proportion, so let me try to anchor it. All of recorded human history is a few thousand years. The entire span since the last Cascadia earthquake is 326 years. 1 million years is more than 3,000 times that entire quiet interval. Whatever the Explorer plate is doing as it slowly tears free, it is doing on a clock so immense that the whole drama of human civilization, past and future, is a rounding error within it. That is the correct scale on which to file the plate fragmentation story. It is real, it is genuinely reshaping the far northern end of the fault, and it has essentially no bearing on the hazard faced by anyone alive now or for many generations to come, which is exactly why it is so important not to let a headline about a plate breaking apart short-circuit the more immediate and more grounded story. The near-term threat is not the million-year detachment at the northern tip. The near-term threat is the same as it has always been, the locked zone along the main length of the fault, loaded with 3 centuries of strain, capable of a magnitude 9, giving no warning. The Explorer plate coming apart is a fascinating footnote to that story, a reminder that the fault is more complex than the textbooks said. It is not a revision of the danger, in either direction. So the plate coming apart is real, it is fascinating, and it explains the odd behaviour at the northern tip of the map, but it is a million-year story unfolding at one end of the fault. It does nothing to relieve the 326 years of strain sitting on the locked zone that runs the length of the coast. The spring is still wound. The plate tearing apart at the top does not unwind it. If anything, it is a reminder that this fault is more complicated, more alive, and less understood than the tidy diagrams suggest, which is all the more reason to keep watching it and to keep it in perspective against everything else that was happening on the planet that same night. Part 9. The Rest of the Ring. Step back from Cascadia for a moment and look at the whole planet the way it appeared on the globe that night, because the context matters. The Earth is a seismically restless place at all times. On an average day, the planet produces tens of thousands of earthquakes, the overwhelming majority too small to feel, and typically somewhere in the range of 100 or more that reach magnitude 5 or above across the course of a year's worth of days. So finding several plate boundaries active on any given night is not unusual. It is the baseline condition of a living planet whose surface is broken into moving plates, all of them grinding against their neighbours somewhere along their edges. The trick is to read that activity in proportion, to know what is ordinary and what actually stands out. Cascadia was not the only place the Earth was busy that night. Far from it. Down in South America, off the Peru and Chile coast, where the Nazca Plate dives beneath the continent along the Peru-Chile Trench, a cluster of earthquakes was ramping up north of Santiago, the largest a magnitude 5.1, with a good deal of smaller activity swarming around it. That region is one of the most productive earthquake zones on the planet, a subduction margin that has generated some of the largest quakes ever recorded, including the magnitude 9.5 that struck Chile in 1960. A cluster there is worth noting, but is well within the normal behaviour of an extremely active boundary. That region is a megaquake factory in its own right, capable of enormous events, and it was clearly more active than a quiet baseline. Further along the same rim, off the coast of Mexico, the Middle America Trench was throwing off a scattering of magnitude 4 events, nothing large, but elevated above its usual hum. Across the Pacific the pattern continued. Off the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East, seismographs were still catching aftershocks from the enormous magnitude 8.8 earthquake that struck there the previous summer, a full year later, which is completely normal for an event that size, the crust still settling and adjusting long after the main shock. In the Philippines, near the Manila Trench, a decent cluster of activity surrounded a magnitude 6.2, with more shallow quakes stirring to the north. Down in the southwest Pacific, a magnitude 5.5 rattled the deep rock of the Tonga Trench, and off the coast of New Zealand's North Island, a modest magnitude 3.3. Taken together, it was a fairly active day on planet Earth, with subduction zones and plate boundaries lighting up on nearly every side of the Pacific. That Kamchatka detail is worth dwelling on for a second, because it tells you something about the scale of these events and how long their echoes last. A magnitude 8.8 is one of the largest earthquakes the planet produces, and when one strikes, it does not simply end when the shaking stops. The crust surrounding the rupture spends months, even years, redistributing the stress the main shock left behind, releasing it in a long, slowly fading barrage of aftershocks. A full year after that Kamchatka giant, the region was still twitching, and that is exactly what physics predicts. It is a useful reminder of the sheer amount of energy involved when a subduction fault of that size lets go, and Cascadia sits in that same weight class. There is also a common misreading of nights like this that is worth heading off, because people see the whole ring of fire active at once and assume the events must be connected, that one earthquake in Chile is somehow triggering another in the Philippines, all of it building towards something. Almost always that is not what is happening. These are independent plate boundaries, separated by thousands of miles, each loading and releasing on its own schedule according to its own local stresses. On any given day, somewhere on Earth, several of them will be active simply because there are so many of them, and they are all always working. The appearance of a coordinated global surge is usually just the ordinary background of a seismically busy planet seen all at once, which is exactly why the honest read of that night was not one of global connection, but of local contrast, and one fault in particular standing apart by its silence. And that is precisely why Cascadia stood out rather than blended in. Every one of those other events was a fault doing something you could see, and in most cases feel. A magnitude 6 is a real earthquake. An aftershock sequence is the visible aftermath of a released giant. Those faults were talking out loud. Cascadia, by contrast, was not producing a magnitude 6 or a magnitude 5 or even a magnitude 4. Cascadia was producing near-silent deep tremor and a single tiny magnitude 2.6. On a night when half the Ring of Fire was audibly grinding away, the most dangerous fault on the North American continent was doing its danger the quiet way, storing rather than releasing, loading rather than failing. The loud faults were spending their stress. The silent one was saving it. That contrast is the whole point, and it is why a trained eye slid past all the 6s and 5s and settled on 307 whispers along a coastline that was not shaking at all. But there is one more comparison worth making, and it is close to home, because just to the south of Cascadia sits a completely different kind of dangerous fault, one that was also stirring that night, and the difference between the two tells you something important about what kind of threat we are actually dealing with. Part 10. A different kind of danger to the south. As the map zoomed in on California that night, a familiar troublemaker was showing signs of life. Across Southern California and up into the central part of the state, small earthquakes were ticking along the San Andreas fault system, including a little activity in the Parkfield section, that famous stretch of the San Andreas where the fault produces moderate earthquakes on an almost clockwork schedule and where scientists have wired the ground more densely than almost anywhere on Earth. There were small quakes near the San Jacinto fault zone and clusters around the Tangled Junction where the Garlock fault meets the San Andreas, a knot of crust that has been locked and stuck for a long time and that appeared, in the observer's words, to be starting to wake up. That junction where the Garlock and San Andreas faults meet is genuinely interesting in its own right, a place where two major fault systems intersect and where the stresses are complicated and not fully understood. Small quakes clustering there are worth noting, and California has its own long list of seismic concerns that deserve their own attention. But I raised the California activity that night not to alarm anyone about the San Andreas, but to sharpen the contrast with Cascadia, because the two coasts represent two fundamentally different bets. In California, the danger is frequent moderate to large earthquakes on faults that talk constantly, where the shaking is severe but the tsunami risk from the main faults is limited and the maximum magnitude is capped lower. In the Pacific Northwest, the danger is a rare, enormous tsunami-generating megaquake on a fault that says almost nothing until the day it says everything. Neither coast is safer than the other in any simple sense. They are dangerous in different ways, on different clocks, with different warning signs. But if you had to name the single fault on the entire west coast of North America most capable of a civilization-scale disaster, the one that could level a region rather than a city, it would not be the famous San Andreas. It would be the quiet one to the north, the one that was not producing felt earthquakes that night at all, the one whose only signal was 307 whispers of deep tremor that no one standing on the ground could feel. Now, the San Andreas is dangerous, and I do not want to soft-pedal that. We have talked before, in our video from June 10th, on the new San Andreas stress study, about research suggesting the southern San Andreas and the neighbouring San Jacinto fault are carrying their highest stress levels in something like 1,000 years. That is a serious, well-founded concern. But the San Andreas is a fundamentally different animal from Cascadia, and the difference is worth understanding because it changes what the small quakes mean. The San Andreas is a transform fault, two plates sliding horizontally past each other, scraping side by side. It is a crustal fault, relatively shallow, and it releases its stress in frequent small and moderate earthquakes, which is exactly why you see that steady trickle of activity along it. A big San Andreas earthquake is a magnitude 7.5, maybe pushing toward 8, and it would be a regional catastrophe. Cascadia is a subduction fault, and it plays in a different league entirely. Where the San Andreas tops out around magnitude 8, Cascadia can reach magnitude 9, and because the earthquake energy scale is logarithmic, that 1 unit difference is not a small step. A magnitude 9 releases roughly 30 times more energy than a magnitude 8, and close to 1,000 times more than a magnitude 7. On top of that, the subduction geometry means Cascadia can generate a major tsunami, which a strike-slip fault like the San Andreas generally cannot. That energy comparison is worth making concrete, because the numbers on the magnitude scale are deceptive. The scale is not linear. Each whole step up represents about 32 times more energy released. So a magnitude 8 is not slightly bigger than a magnitude 7, it is more than 30 times bigger. And a magnitude 9 is more than 30 times bigger than that again, which is why it lands close to 1,000 times the energy of a magnitude 7. When people casually lump a big San Andreas quake and a big Cascadia quake into the same mental category of major earthquake, they are collapsing a distinction of nearly 1,000-fold in released energy, along with the difference between a fault that shakes for tens of seconds and one that shakes for minutes, and the difference between a fault that stays on land and one that can heave the seafloor and launch an ocean. The two faults also differ in how much warning their behaviour gives you, which loops directly back to the theme of this whole story. The San Andreas is talkative. Its constant small and moderate earthquakes are, in a sense, a running commentary on its state, and while they do not let anyone predict the big one, they at least keep the fault in the public consciousness. People in California feel earthquakes regularly, so the threat stays vivid. Cascadia offers none of that. It gives the surface almost nothing for generations at a stretch, and so the more dangerous of the two faults, the one capable of the larger earthquake and the tsunami, is also the one that is easiest to forget, precisely because it so rarely reminds anyone it is there. The night of the 14th, with its silent tremor along the full margin, was one of those rare reminders, delivered in a voice too quiet to hear without instruments. So the small quakes ticking along the San Andreas that night, and the near-silent tremor humming under Cascadia are not two versions of the same warning. They are two different kinds of fault with two different personalities. The San Andreas mutters constantly and releases in 8s. Cascadia stays silent and releases in 9s, and of the two, it is the silent one, the one that gives the least warning and holds the most power, that had the deep tremor lighting up its full length that night. Which brings us to the question everyone in the Pacific Northwest eventually has to face, the one that turns all of this science into something personal: what actually happens when Cascadia finally lets go. Part 11. Minutes that last a lifetime. The first thing to understand about a full Cascadia rupture is the duration, because duration is the detail that most people get wrong, and it is the detail that matters most. When you imagine an earthquake, you probably imagine something that lasts a few seconds. A jolt, a rattle, maybe 10 or 15 seconds of shaking in a bad one. A magnitude 9 on Cascadia would not be that. When a fault 1,000 kilometers long ruptures from one end to the other, the shaking does not arrive and depart in seconds. It builds, and it holds, and it goes on for something like 3 to 5 minutes. The reason comes down to simple geometry. The size of an earthquake is tied to how much fault surface breaks, and how long that rupture takes to travel. A small earthquake breaks a small patch and is over almost instantly. A magnitude 9 breaks a fault the length of an entire coastline, and the rupture front, the boundary where the fault is actively tearing, has to physically propagate along all 1,000 kilometers of it. That propagation takes time, several minutes, and the ground keeps shaking the whole while, from the first section that breaks until the last. So the duration is not incidental. It is a direct consequence of the enormous length of fault involved, and it is one of the surest signatures that what you are feeling is a great subduction earthquake rather than an ordinary local one. Those minutes matter enormously for survival, and not only because of structural fatigue. Prolonged shaking gives landslides time to mobilize on steep terrain, gives soils time to liquefy, and gives the shaking itself time to find and exploit every weakness in every structure. It also means that people caught in it will have to endure something psychologically brutal, an earthquake that does not stop when the mind expects it to, that keeps going well past the point of terror. Understanding this in advance is itself a form of preparation, because someone who knows that a great Cascadia quake will shake for minutes, not seconds, is less likely to freeze in disbelief and more likely to do the one thing that helps, which is to protect themselves during the shaking and then move immediately once it stops. Try, right now, to imagine the ground beneath you moving violently for 5 straight minutes. Count it out. It is an almost unbearable length of time. Buildings that can survive 15 seconds of shaking can shake apart when the same forces are applied for 300 seconds, because fatigue accumulates, connections work loose, and structures that held at the start come down at the end. That extended shaking does something else, something specific to the geology of the region, and it connects directly back to those ghost forests we talked about. During the rupture, the coastline itself drops. As the locked zone finally releases and the upper plate lurches seaward and settles, large stretches of the coast can subside, sink, by a metre or more than 3 feet, in the span of those few minutes. That is not a slow process over years. It is instantaneous on a human scale. Land that was dry before the earthquake is suddenly below the high tide line after it. That is exactly what killed those cedar and spruce trees in 1700. The land dropped, the sea rushed in, and the forest drowned where they stood. A future rupture would do the same thing to whatever sits on that land now. There is a second effect of prolonged, violent shaking that turns soft ground into a hazard all its own, and it is called liquefaction. In areas where the soil is loose, wet, and sandy, the kind of ground you find in river deltas, filled land, and coastal lowlands, sustained shaking can cause the soil to temporarily behave like a liquid. The grains, jostled violently, lose contact with one another, and water fills the spaces between them, and suddenly the solid ground beneath a building has the consistency of quicksand. Structures can tilt, sink, or topple, even if they survive the shaking itself, and buried pipes and foundations can be torn apart. Many of the places people have built along that coast, ports, industrial districts, low-lying neighbourhoods, sit on exactly the kind of ground most prone to liquefaction, which is part of why a Great Cascadia earthquake is expected to be so damaging to infrastructure specifically. And here is the thing that ties the danger back to the quiet loading we keep returning to. All of these consequences, the minutes of shaking, the dropping coastline, the liquefying ground, are the release of the very strain that the slow slip and deep tremor have been quietly building for centuries. The gentleness of the signal is in almost cruel proportion to the violence of the eventual payout. Nothing you can feel in the decades of quiet, and nothing you would have felt in that near-silent tremor on the night of the 14th, carries any hint of what the fault is loading toward. That mismatch between a warning too soft to sense and an outcome too large to fully imagine is the essential problem of living above Cascadia, and it is why so much depends on preparing in advance rather than waiting for a signal that will never come in a form you can feel. And here is why the loading we have been talking about all episode is not an abstraction. Every one of those slow slip events, every burst of deep tremor like the 307 points on the night of July 14th, is nudging the locked zone toward exactly this outcome. The tremor is quiet, the slip is silent. But the thing it is loading toward is 3 to 5 minutes of violent shaking and a coastline that drops in an instant. The gap between the gentleness of the signal and the enormity of the eventual release is the whole reason this fault is so unnerving. Nothing you can feel is preparing you for something you cannot imagine. Then comes the water, and the water is where the clock becomes merciless. When the seafloor offshore suddenly heaves during the rupture, it shoves the entire column of ocean above it upward, and that displaced water spreads outward as a tsunami. The mechanism is worth understanding precisely, because it is what separates a subduction earthquake from every other kind. In the rupture, the leading edge of the upper plate, which has been dragged down and held under tension for centuries, springs back upward and seaward. That vertical motion of the seafloor lifts an enormous area of ocean with it, and water, being nearly incompressible, has to go somewhere. It races outward in all directions as a series of long, fast, low waves that barely register in the open ocean, but pile up into towering walls of water as they reach shallow coastal shelves. This is why only faults that move the seafloor vertically, subduction faults, tend to produce the great ocean-crossing tsunamis, and why the sideways grinding San Andreas generally does not. For the far side of the Pacific, for Japan, that wave takes the better part of a day to arrive, which is how the orphan tsunami reached Honshu 9 or 10 hours after the 1700 earthquake. But for the coastline directly above the fault, for the beaches and bays of Oregon, Washington, Northern California and Vancouver Island, there is no 9 hours, there are minutes. The tsunami can come ashore within roughly 15 to 30 minutes of the shaking stopping, and in some places even less. There is no time to wait for an official warning to travel through the system. The shaking itself is the warning. In tsunami country along that coast, the rule the experts teach is brutally simple. If the ground shakes hard and long, and especially if it keeps shaking for minutes, you do not wait for a siren or a phone alert. You move to high ground immediately, because the wave may be only minutes behind the shaking. That is the reality the deep tremor is quietly building toward, and it is why understanding this fault is not academic for anyone who lives, works, or vacations along that shore. This is one place where the science translates into something genuinely actionable, and I want to make sure it lands clearly, because it is the single most life-saving piece of knowledge in this entire story. The natural warning system for a Cascadia tsunami is the earthquake itself. Long, strong shaking near the coast is the signal, not a text message, not a loudspeaker, though those may come too, but the ground beneath your feet moving for far longer than any ordinary earthquake. Anyone standing on that coast when the shaking stretches past 30 seconds and keeps going should already be moving inland and uphill without waiting for anything else. Coastal towns throughout the Pacific Northwest have mapped their tsunami inundation zones, posted evacuation routes, and in some places built vertical evacuation structures for areas where high ground is too far to reach on foot. Knowing your route before the ground ever moves is the difference between a manageable evacuation and a desperate one, and this is where the abstract tremor on a monitor and the concrete safety of a family on a beach finally connect. The 307 epicenters on the night of the 14th were a signal only instruments could read, meaning nothing you could act on in the moment. But the fact that the deep fault is loading, that the strain is accumulating, that the odds are what they are, is precisely why the coastal communities do the mapping and the drilling and the planning now, in the long quiet while there is time. The tremor cannot tell a family when to run, but the knowledge of what the tremor is loading toward is exactly what should get that family to learn their evacuation route this year, not after the ground starts moving. Part 12. The Weight of Knowing. There is a strange psychological burden that comes with living above a fault like this, and I think it is worth talking about honestly because it shapes how people react to a night like July 14th. The burden is this: you know it is coming. Not maybe, not possibly. The geology is unambiguous. Cascadia has ruptured roughly 19 times in the last 6,500 years. It will rupture again, and the only genuine uncertainty is when. Living with a threat that is certain in the long run but completely unpredictable in the short run does something to people. Some respond by pushing it out of mind entirely, because a danger you cannot schedule is a danger that is hard to stay afraid of. Others respond by latching onto every tremor count and every small quake, as if it were the final warning. Neither response is quite right, and the science points toward a healthier middle path. That middle path is preparation without panic, and it is genuinely the most useful thing to take away from all of this. Because here is a fact that cuts against the helplessness. The death toll of a great earthquake is not written by geology alone. It is written by geology multiplied by human decisions made in advance. We have seen this contrast play out around the world again and again. The same magnitude of earthquake can kill a handful of people in one country and tens of thousands in another, and the difference is almost never the fault. It is the buildings, the preparation, the drills, the early planning. A region that has retrofitted its schools and hospitals, that has mapped its tsunami zones and practiced the evacuation, that has taught its residents to move to high ground the moment the shaking lasts too long, is a region that can absorb a magnitude 9 and survive it. A region that has done none of those things is not. Japan is the clearest example of what preparation buys. It sits atop some of the most active subduction zones on Earth, and it has been struck by enormous earthquakes throughout its history, including the magnitude 9 that hit its northeast coast in 2011. That event was catastrophic, and yet the scale of the loss would have been vastly worse in a country that had not spent decades building to strict seismic codes, drilling school children in earthquake response, constructing seawalls, and teaching entire coastal populations the reflex to flee to high ground the instant strong shaking begins. Japan lost people it should not have lost, and it learned hard lessons about where its preparations fell short, but it also demonstrated that a society can face the largest earthquakes the planet produces and still function, still rebuild, still protect the overwhelming majority of its people. The geology handed Japan a magnitude 9. Human decisions determined how many walked away from it. The Pacific Northwest is, in a real sense, at an earlier point on that same road. It has known about the full scope of the Cascadia threat only since the late 20th century, when the 1700 detective story came together and the ghost forests gave up their secret. That is a very short time in which to retrofit a region that was largely built before anyone knew the fault could do this. There is enormous work underway, and enormous work still to do, and that is precisely why the region keeps talking about Cascadia, keeps running drills, keeps studying the fault. Not because talking about it will change the geology, but because the one variable humans actually control, their own preparation, is the variable that will decide the outcome. Every reminder, including a quiet night of tremor, is a chance to close a little more of that gap. That is the reason the Pacific Northwest talks about Cascadia at all. It is not to frighten people into paralysis. In our video from late June, when a magnitude 5.5 struck offshore of Oregon, and rattled nerves all the way to Victoria. The point was the same as it is tonight. These reminders, whether it is a felt quake or a surge of silent tremor, are not countdowns. They are prompts. They are the fault's way of pulling the region's attention back to something it is very tempting to forget. And each prompt is a chance to check the emergency kit, to know the evacuation route, to have the conversation with the family about where to meet, to know whether the building you sleep in was built to modern code. None of that requires knowing the date of the earthquake. All of it is worth doing precisely because you cannot know the date. I find something almost freeing in that framing, once you sit with it. If a reliable prediction existed, people might reasonably wait for it, deferring the uncomfortable work of preparation until the warning came. But because no such prediction exists and never has, the only rational strategy is to be ready in a general standing way, all the time, the way you keep a smoke detector working, even though you cannot predict the night of a fire. The absence of a countdown, which feels at first like the most frightening part of the Cascadia story, is actually what clarifies the right response. You stop waiting for a signal that will never come and you simply prepare, because preparation is the one thing entirely within your control, and it pays off no matter when the fault decides to break. And the preparation is not exotic. It is water and food for a couple of weeks, because a great earthquake could sever roads, water lines, and power for a long time. It is knowing how to shut off your gas, having a plan for how your family reconnects if separated, securing the heavy furniture that becomes a projectile in prolonged shaking, and, for anyone near the coast, knowing the walking route to high ground and committing to the rule that long, strong shaking means move immediately. None of it is dramatic. All of it is the difference, multiplied across millions of people, between a region that endures a magnitude 9 and 1 that is broken by it. That is the quiet, unglamorous core of what it means to live responsibly above this fault. So when the tremor lit up the whole margin, on the night of the 14th, the right response was not to flee and it was not to shrug. It was to notice, to let the deep engine's rare visible moments serve as the reminder it can be. The fault is loading. The southern end carries the higher near-term odds. The full margin worst case is a 1 in 7 to 1 in 10 proposition over the next 50 years. And the single most important variable in how that story ends, whenever it ends, is not something happening 16 miles under the seafloor. It is something happening in the choices of the people who live above it. That is a genuinely hopeful thought buried inside a frightening one, and it is the note I want to hold on to as we deal with the wilder claims that always swirl around a fault like this, because when something is this powerful and this unpredictable, the theories multiply fast. Part 13. What people are saying and what the science shows. Whenever the Cascadia tremor surges and a story like this starts circulating, a predictable set of alternative explanations comes with it, and I do not want to just wave them away, because some of them come from real and reasonable places even when they land in the wrong spot. So let us walk through them, honestly, the way we always try to do here, and see what holds up. The first and most common claim is that scientists secretly know when the earthquake is coming and are hiding it to prevent panic. I understand the emotional logic. A threat this big feels like the kind of thing authorities would cover up, but the actual structure of the science makes a cover-up essentially impossible. The tremor map is public and updates in near real time. The positioning data is public. The probability estimates, the 10 to 15% for a full rupture, the roughly 1 in 3 for a southern partial, are published openly by government agencies and universities. If anyone, anywhere, had cracked the code for predicting the exact timing of a great earthquake, it would be the single most important scientific result in the history of the field, and it would be impossible to keep quiet. The reason there is no public countdown is not secrecy. It is that no countdown exists to hide. The silence of the authorities on timing is the honest reflection of a genuine limit, not a conspiracy. The second claim runs in the opposite direction from the first, and it is the one that gets amplified most on a night like the 14th. The tremor is spiking, therefore the big one is days or weeks away. We have spent this whole episode on why that does not follow, but let me put it as plainly as I can. The tremor is deep. The great earthquake nucleates shallow, in the locked zone, which the tremor does not directly report on. A margin-wide tremor episode is a normal recurring feature of this fault's behavior, something that happens on a rhythm of months, over and over, the overwhelming majority of the time ending in nothing dramatic at all. Elevated attention is warranted. Imminent catastrophe is not indicated. Confusing the two is how you burn out your own alarm system and stop listening when it actually matters. I want to be fair to the kernel of truth inside this second claim, because there is one, and glossing over it would be dishonest. It is genuinely true that during a slow slip event, the stress being transferred onto the locked zone means the probability of triggering a great earthquake is slightly elevated compared to a completely quiet period. Scientists acknowledge this openly, and there have been times when Cascadia researchers issued quiet, measured advisories during particularly large slip episodes, noting that the coming weeks carried marginally higher odds. So the instinct that tremor and elevated risk are connected is not baseless. Where the claim goes wrong is in the magnitude of the effect. Slightly elevated does not mean imminent. The odds might move from extremely low to slightly less extremely low. The overwhelming likelihood, even during an active episode, is still that nothing happens, that the slip runs its course and the fault locks back up for another cycle. The honest posture is to hold both truths at once, a real but small increase in risk, wrapped inside an overwhelming likelihood of a quiet outcome. The reason this matters so much is practical. If people treat every tremor episode as a countdown to catastrophe, two bad things happen. First, they exhaust themselves with fear over events that almost always pass without incident, which is corrosive to actually living in a place. And second, and more dangerously, they train themselves to stop believing the warnings, because episode after episode comes and goes with nothing, and eventually the alarm becomes background noise. The goal is not to be perpetually terrified by the deep tremor. The goal is to let it do what it can honestly do, which is to serve as a periodic prompt to stay prepared, while understanding clearly that it is not, and cannot be, a signal that the earthquake is about to strike. The third claim is the mirror image of a real discovery, and it is subtle. Because that imaging study earlier this year showed the descending plate tearing apart, some people concluded that Cascadia must therefore be shutting down, breaking up, losing its ability to produce a giant earthquake, so the threat is overblown. But as we covered, the tearing is a phenomenon at the far northern tip of the zone, unfolding over a timescale of about 1 million years, and the researchers were explicit that it does not reduce the near-term hazard. The main locked length of the fault is untouched by it, and remains loaded with 3 centuries of strain. A crack forming at one end of a wound spring does not release the spring, and then there is the family of claims that reach for human causes, that the tremor or the coming earthquake is somehow triggered or engineered by weapons, by high-frequency transmitters, by deliberate manipulation. These theories tend to appear around every major seismic event, and I understand part of where they come from, because there is a real and unsettling fact underneath them. Human activity can, in specific and limited circumstances, cause small earthquakes. Injecting wastewater deep underground near faults, filling large reservoirs, and certain mining operations have all been shown to induce modest seismicity. That is genuine science, not conspiracy. So the idea that people can affect faults is not crazy on its face. The error is in the leap from small induced quakes near an injection well to the notion that anyone could trigger, or is triggering, a magnitude 9 on a subduction zone. The reason that leap fails is a matter of raw energy. The forces at work in a subduction zone, an entire oceanic plate sinking into the mantle, dwarf anything human technology can muster by so many orders of magnitude that the comparison is almost comical. The stress that will one day break Cascadia has been accumulating from plate tectonics for 326 years and more. No transmitter, no device, no human system is adding to it or setting it off. The engine that is loading this fault is the same engine that has been building and moving continents for the entire history of the planet, and it does not need and cannot receive any help from us. To put a number on the mismatch, the energy released in a great subduction earthquake is on the order of what the sun delivers to the entire Earth in a fraction of a second, concentrated into a single fault, an amount so enormous that the strongest human-made energy sources are smaller by many orders of magnitude, a factor of not 10 or 100, but something closer to 1 trillion or more depending on what you compare. Trying to trigger a magnitude 9 with any human device is not like trying to push a boulder that is a little too heavy. It is like trying to move a mountain range by leaning on it. The scale is simply not in the same universe. When you understand the energy budget, the engineered earthquake theories do not just look unlikely, they look physically impossible, and that impossibility is not a matter of opinion but of arithmetic. I spend time on these alternative claims not to mock the people who raise them, because the underlying anxiety is completely legitimate. There really is a giant loaded fault off that coast. It really will produce a catastrophe someday, and it is genuinely frightening that no one can say when. When something is that big and that uncertain, the mind reaches for explanations that restore a sense of control, whether that is a secret government that knows, or a hidden weapon to blame, or a countdown that at least would let you prepare. The honest science offers none of those comforts. It offers a loaded fault, a real but small elevation of risk during slip episodes, a firm ceiling on prediction, and a clear path forward through preparation. That is less satisfying than a conspiracy in some ways, and far more useful in every way that actually matters. Which leaves us exactly where the honest science leaves us, standing on a quiet coast above a loaded fault, and facing the one feature of this whole story that unsettles me the most, the quiet itself. Part 14. The calm before the storm. Think about how human beings are built to detect danger. We evolved to notice things that move, things that make noise, things that change. A predator in the grass, a rising river, a darkening sky. Our entire alarm system is tuned to signals we can sense, and when a threat announces itself, we react. The problem with Cascadia is that it defeats that system completely. It is a threat with almost no signal. For 326 years, it has given the surface nothing to feel, nothing to hear, nothing our instincts can lock onto. And that is not a flaw in the threat. That is the nature of it. The very thing that makes Cascadia so dangerous is the same thing that makes it so easy to ignore. Its silence is not the absence of danger. Its silence is the danger, wearing the costume of calm. This is what makes the phrase "the calm before the storm" so exactly right for this fault, and also so much deeper than the cliché suggests. In an ordinary storm, the calm before it is a brief lull, minutes or hours, and then the storm comes and the calm is explained. With Cascadia, the calm has lasted more than 3 centuries. It is not a lull before a known event on a known timeline. It is the entire lived experience of everyone who has ever built a home, raised a family, or grown old on that coast since 1700. Nobody alive has felt Cascadia break. The calm is so total, so multi-generational, that it stops feeling like a prelude at all and starts feeling like the permanent state of the world. And that is the trap. Because the calm is a prelude. It has always been a prelude. Every quiet year is not evidence that the fault is safe. It is one more year of strain wound into a spring that has no choice but to eventually release. There is a psychological principle at work here that goes beyond earthquakes, and it explains a lot of how people relate to rare, enormous risks. Human beings calibrate their sense of danger to their own experience. If you have never seen a thing happen, and your parents never saw it, and your grandparents never saw it, it becomes almost impossible to truly believe it can happen, no matter what the data says. The knowledge lives in your head as an abstract fact, but it does not live in your gut as a felt reality. Cascadia exploits this perfectly. Its cycle is so long that it spans many human lifetimes, which means the direct visceral memory of its power exists nowhere in the living population. The only witnesses were the people of 1700 and the generations of oral tradition that carried the story forward, and even that thread is thin now. So the fault gets to be simultaneously certain and unimaginable, a combination that is almost designed to be underestimated, and yet the geology does not care in the slightest about human intuition. The strain accumulates at the same relentless few centimetres a year, whether anyone believes in it or not. The spring winds identically through the years people spend thinking about the fault and the years they spend forgetting it. This is the deepest reason the quiet is dangerous. It is not just that the fault gives no physical signal, it is that the very length of its silence lulls the human mind into treating the silence as safety, when the silence is the most dangerous thing about it. The calm is not the absence of the storm. The calm is the storm gathering itself, in a rhythm too slow for a single human life to perceive as motion at all. And this is exactly why a night like July 14th is worth stopping for, even though the tremor changes none of the odds by itself. Because for a few hours, the fault stopped being perfectly silent. The deep engine became briefly visible. 307 points of tremor traced the outline of the machine along the entire coast, and a single small quake stirred 16 miles down at the southern end. It was not the storm. It was not even the first gust of the storm. But it was the calm cracking open just far enough to remind us that there is something underneath it. The tremor is the fault talking in the only voice it has, a voice too low for us to hear without instruments, saying nothing about when, but confirming unmistakably that the machine is still running, still loading, still winding. And this reframes what the tremor actually gave us that night, which was not a warning in the ordinary sense, but something rarer and, in a way, more valuable. It gave us a moment of contact with a process that is almost always hidden. For a few hours, the fault that defines itself by silence made a sound, faint and deep and readable only by machines, but a sound nonetheless. The 307 epicenters were not the fault announcing its intentions. They were the fault revealing its ongoing existence, confirming that beneath the calm the machinery is turning, that the quiet is active rather than dormant, that the loading we can only otherwise infer from theory is really measurably happening. That is worth something, even if it changes no odds and predicts no date. It is a reminder made visible. I keep coming back to a single contrast, and I want to leave it with you clearly. On the night of the 14th, the loud faults of the world were busy spending their stress in 5s and 6s, in aftershocks and swarms, all around the Pacific Rim, and in the middle of all that noise the one fault capable of a 9 sat nearly silent, saving everything, releasing nothing, its danger measured not in what it did that night, but in what it did not do, in the stress it kept rather than spent. The faults you can hear are the faults that are unloading. The fault you cannot hear is the one to fear. Cascadia has perfected the art of the quiet, and the quiet is not mercy. It is arithmetic. 326 years of it, and counting. Part 15. Watching a fault built to stay silent. So where does all of this leave us standing here on the 15th of July, 2026, looking back at what the instruments caught the night before? It leaves us with a fault that is exactly as dangerous today as it was the day before the tremor started, and exactly as dangerous as it will be next week when the tremor fades and the map goes quiet again. Nothing about the 307 epicenters changed the odds. The full margin worst case is still somewhere around a 1 in 7 to 1 in 10 chance over the next 50 years. The southern partial rupture is still closer to 1 in 3. 3 centuries and a quarter of strain are still stored in the locked zone. What changed on the night of the 14th was not the danger. What changed was our ability for a few hours to see the danger working. That, in the end, is what scientists are watching. Not a gauge creeping toward red, not a countdown ticking toward 0. They are watching the deep heartbeat of a fault that will not tell them when it plans to break, gathering everything they can about how it behaves so that the region above it can be as ready as human preparation allows. They watch the tremor migrate along the margin. They watch the coastline creep and bulge under the load. They watch the southern end with a little extra care because that is where the shortest fuse runs, and they hold, every single day, the same uncomfortable truth we have circled all episode. The fault is loading. The fault cannot be predicted. Both things are true at once, and no amount of watching resolves the tension between them, because the tension is not a gap in our knowledge. It is a feature of the fault. It is tempting to find that unsatisfying, and I understand the impulse. We live in an age that expects data to yield answers, that assumes if we point enough instruments at a problem we will eventually crack it. And in so many domains that assumption pays off. But Cascadia is a reminder that some things resist prediction not because we have not tried hard enough, but because of what they fundamentally are. The locked zone stores its strain in silence and releases it without preamble. That is not a puzzle waiting for a cleverer sensor. It is the nature of a brittle fault under load. The most honest thing the scientific community can say, after decades of extraordinary work, is that they understand this fault better than almost any on Earth and still cannot tell you when it will break. That humility is not a failure. It is the accurate description of a hard limit, and there is a strange integrity in stating it plainly rather than pretending to a certainty that does not exist. So the watching continues, not as a countdown but as a form of stewardship. Every episode of tremor that migrates along the margin, every millimetre of creep the positioning stations record, every deep small quake like the one at the southern end on the night of the 14th, gets folded into an ever sharper understanding of how this fault lives and breathes. That understanding does not buy a prediction. What it buys is preparation, refined hazard maps, better building codes, smarter tsunami evacuation planning, a population that is a little more aware each year of what lies offshore. In the absence of a countdown, that steady, patient watching paired with steady, patient preparation is the best and most rational response available to anyone living in the shadow of a fault built to stay silent. If there is a single idea I would want you to carry out of all of this, it is that the quiet is not the same as the safe, and that the two are in fact opposites on a fault like this one. Everything about Cascadia conspires to make its silence feel like reassurance. The generations without a great earthquake, the near-total absence of felt activity, the way the beautiful coastline gives no hint of what lies beneath it. And every bit of that apparent peace is, in reality, the fault storing rather than spending, loading rather than releasing, winding rather than resting. The night the tremor lit up the margin did not break that peace. It briefly let us see the machine underneath it, and the machine was doing exactly what it has been doing silently for 326 years, working, loading, waiting. Here is the thought I cannot shake, and I will leave it with you honestly rather than tie it up in a neat bow. We have learned to read this fault's history with astonishing precision. We know it broke on the evening of January 26, 1700, at about 9 o'clock at night. We know it did so as a magnitude 9, that it dropped the coast and drowned the forests, and sent a wave that flooded Japan 10 hours later with no earthquake attached. We reconstructed all of that from dead trees, buried marshes, foreign temple records, and the memories of the people who were there. We can read the past of Cascadia down to the season, and yet we cannot read its future down to the century. The same fault that signed its last great work so clearly that we could date it 300 years later will give us no signature at all for its next one until the ground is already moving. So when the tremor lit up the whole margin that night, and a small deep quake whispered at the southern end, the only honest question to ask was also the one with no answer. Was that the fault breathing? One more slow exhale in a rhythm that has ticked along for centuries and will tick along for years to come? Or was it the fault loading? One more increment of strain handed up to a locked zone that is 326 years into its wait and running out of reasons to keep waiting. The instruments cannot tell the difference. The scientists cannot tell the difference. Nobody can tell the difference, not until the calm finally ends. And that, more than any number on any map, is what it means to watch the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It is to stand above the most powerful fault on the continent, in the middle of the longest quiet it has ever shown us, and to know that the silence you're listening to is the exact sound the storm makes right before it arrives.